Hello, my name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this series of videos, I'm taking an in-depth look at Karl Popper's article Science, Conjectures and Refutations. And we got to paragraph 6 in the last video. In this video, we are going to look at the 4 remaining sections 7 to 10. Now, to be honest, I find these sections, in which Popper is going to sort of summarize and finalize his solution to the problem of induction, I find these sections very frustrating. It seems to me that Popper continually uses ambiguous language and strange ways of presentation that generate two kinds of confusion. First of all, Popper makes it very easy for us to confuse inductivism with unintelligent dogmatism. So if unintelligent dogmatism is the idea that, okay, I have the truth and I'm not going to look at any negative evidence ever, that's not the same thing as inductivism. That's not the same thing as believing that there are valid inductive arguments. But Popper is going to present things in such a way that it's easy to confuse these two things. On the other hand, Popper is going to present things in such a way that it's easy to confuse his own stance, which is quite extreme. And by extreme, I don't mean false. By extreme, I mean way outside of the mainstream of thinking. So his own position, which is quite extreme, he makes it easy to confuse that with very middle-of-the-road things to say that basically everyone agrees on. And so we're also going to see in the text that Popper phrases his own position in ways that allow us to read him as saying what any scientist, or for that matter any inductivist, might say, while meaning something else, while meaning something that he, as a skeptic about induction, as somebody who absolutely refuses to believe that there is rational induction, that he actually takes up. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to spend quite a bit of my time in this video looking at those kinds of ambiguities. And that really already starts at the very beginning, when Popper makes a distinction between the dogmatic and the critical attitude. And he says this. He says, the dogmatic attitude is clearly related to the tendency to verify our laws and schemata by seeking to apply them and to confirm them, even to the point of neglecting refutations. Whereas the critical attitude is one of readiness to change them, to test them, to refute them, to falsify them if possible. This suggests that we may identify the critical attitude with the scientific attitude, and the dogmatic attitude with the one which we have described as pseudo-scientific. So here Popper is, talking about dogmatism and criticism as sort of two poles of what I would say is a spectrum. And he presents things in such a way that it looks as if the inductivist and the dogmatist are the same thing. But let's read that one phrase again. The tendency to verify our laws and schemata by seeking to apply them and to confirm them, even to the point of neglecting refutations. Any inductivist worth their salt is going to say, well, one of the things we do as scientists is confirm our theories. Right? How do you confirm a theory? Well, you test it, and if the test is positive for the theory, that's a confirmation. Doesn't prove that the theory is true, but it, raises our acceptance of the theory. No inductivist who is worth their salt is going to tell you to neglect refutations. Right? That very same test, which may confirm the theory, may also disconfirm the theory. Right? May also lower our acceptance of the theory. That is the basic idea of any inductivist philosophy of science, or really any inductivist philosophy of reasoning. So that little phrase, even to the point of neglecting refutations, is doing a lot of work here. It ties the attitude that believes in confirmation to an extreme dogmatism that doesn't believe in negative evidence. That's, I would say almost dishonest. Right? It suggests that Popper's own position, which is going to emphasize the critical, which is going to emphasize the critical to the exclusion of everything else, it presents that as the only alternative to an unintelligent dogmatism that never sees any negative evidence. But that's not the real situation. Right? The real situation is this. On the one hand, there is the dogmatist who never sees any negative evidence. Right? For the dogmatist, there is nothing that is going to lower their acceptance of the theory. And then on the other extreme, there's the falsificationist. There's Popper, who doesn't believe in positive evidence. Right? For Popper, there is nothing that is going to raise his acceptance of the theory. There's nothing that counts as a rational reason for believing that the theory is true, for raising the probability of the theory. So those are the two extremes, and in between them is the inductivist, who says, there's positive and negative evidence. Theories can be confirmed and disconfirmed. That is the true story. And if you present the story that way, then we see that Popper has a very strong burden of proof. Right? Popper has to convince us, again, he's been trying to do this by talking about Hume, but he has to convince us that there is no such thing as positive evidence, that nothing counts as a good reason for believing a theory, for having confidence in a theory. He has to convince us of that, and then he has to convince us that that actually works, right? That is actually how science operates. But Popper sets up the situation in a very different way, right? In such a way that it seems as if his only enemy is someone who doesn't believe in falsifications, someone who doesn't believe in negative evidence at all. Well, I can win against somebody who doesn't believe in negative evidence at all. That's not science. That's clear. But is what Popper describes science, or is the middle-of-the-road inductivist position science? That is the question. Now, of course, if you're Popper, you're going to say, there's nothing middle of the road about inductivism, because inductivists believe in the rationality of induction, and induction isn't rational. Okay, that is fair, right? That is the core of the question here. Could it be rational to engage in induction? But if you want to present science in terms of positive and negative evidence and attitudes towards that evidence, then the story I've been telling is the right story, and the story that Popper is telling is not the right story. And so here, at this point, we are not engaged in a serious question about the possibility of inductive reasoning. Right? Popper actually hasn't said so much about that. Really, what Popper is doing is he's presenting his own view of science, which doesn't use induction, and he wants us to see that that is how science actually operates. Well, you had better be very clear about what your position is and how science actually operates and how those two things fit together, if that is supposed to be an argument in favor of your denial of induction. Okay, so let's keep this in mind. Let's keep in mind that the extreme dogmatist and the inductivist are in no way the same person, and that Popper doesn't just have to show that sometimes there is negative evidence which lowers our belief in a theory. He has to show that there is never positive evidence, that it makes sense to think of science even if there is no such thing as positive evidence, right? Because the inductivist is going to say, well, if there's no induction, if there's no such thing as positive evidence, then there is also no such thing as science, at least not science as we know it. Okay, having, prepared ourselves for reading the rest of these sections, let us move on. Here's what Popper says a little bit further on, right? He says, the Greeks' discovery of the critical method gave rise at first to the mistaken hope that it would lead to the solution of all the great odd problems, that it would establish certainty, that it would help to prove our theories, to justify them. But this hope was a residue of the dogmatic way of thinking. In fact, nothing can be justified or proved outside of mathematics and logic. Here again, Popper engages in I would always say one of his trademark, at least in this article, one of his trademark ambiguities. It's the phrase, to prove our theories, to justify them. Prove and justify are presented as being, basically the same thing. But they're not the same thing at all, right? To prove a theory, okay, proof, that's something that only happens in logic and mathematics, right? That is where you have some, maybe self-chosen or immediately evident or whatever axioms, and you prove from them using deductive logic some conclusion that is then, at least within the system, perfectly certain. Nothing in science can be proved. But that's not the same thing as justified. Surely I am justified in believing that the Romans used to occupy the southern part of the Netherlands. I think that that's true. I believe that most powerfully. I think I'm justified in believing that, given all the archaeological evidence, all the written evidence, and so on and so forth. It's not proven in the sense that a mathematical theorem can be proven, but there's a lot of positive evidence for it that justifies my belief. Well, that is what the inductivist is saying. And it's absolutely unclear that justification, that kind of justification doesn't happen in mathematics and logic at all. So how can Popper sort of equate these two things, to prove and to justify? Well, he can't, but he does. And why does he do it? Well, it's easy to think that he does it because it's so much easier to argue against people who think that scientific theories can be proven, the extreme dogmatists, than to argue against people who think that scientific theories can be justified, people who believe in induction. But they're not the same. We have to keep them apart. They're completely different positions. Okay, so Popper really does his best to sort of muddy the waters, to sort of, not even with an argument, not even explicitly, but with the use of this comma, to sort of set proving and justification as the same thing, even though they are clearly very, very different things indeed. Okay, let's go on a little bit further. Hume was right in stressing that our theories cannot be validly inferred from what we know to be true. And I'm going to pause this for a moment because I have to open my front door. So, sorry for that interruption, but I had to open the door where somebody came to deliver my wife's noise-cancelling headphones. Which means that she can work and I can make videos at the same time. Isn't that great for all of us? Alright, let me restart that quote. Hume was right in stressing that our theories cannot be validly inferred from what we know to be true, neither from observations nor from anything else. He concluded from this that our belief in them was irrational. If belief means here our inability to doubt our natural laws and the constancy of natural regularities, then Hume is again right. This kind of dogmatic belief has, one might say, a physiological rather than a rational basis. If, however, the term belief is taken to cover our critical acceptance of scientific theories, a tentative acceptance combined with an eagerness to revise the theory if we succeed in designing a test which it cannot pass, then Hume was wrong. In such an acceptance of theories, there is nothing irrational. This whole passage seems to describe quite perfectly an inductivist argument against Hume. It's what the inductivist would say, right? The inductivist would say, Hume, okay, if you mean by, having evidence for a theory, if you mean having evidence that proves that the theory is right, evidence that makes it the case that we can't doubt the theory anymore, that we don't have to test it anymore, that doesn't exist. But, there is positive evidence. There is such a thing as positive evidence. There is such a thing as inductive reasoning, and it leads not to dogmatic acceptance, but to tentative acceptance, right? In varying degrees. Sometimes we are almost certain that the theory is right. Well, almost certain, right? We're still open to negative evidence, of course. And sometimes we are a bit certain. Sometimes we think it may well be true or might be true or, is at least worth looking into. There's a wide degree of varieties of acceptance, but all of them are tentative, and that is precisely what inductive reasoning is supposed to give us. But of course, this is not meant to be a summary of the inductivist position. This is meant to be a summary of Popper's position. But as a summary of Popper's position, it is very curious indeed. Because what can Popper, who has rejected induction altogether, what can Popper mean by tentative acceptance? Well, normally when we think about the acceptance of a theory, we think of accepting it as true. Accepting it maybe as likely to be true, or accepting it with a certain, degree of confidence as true. That is what acceptance means. But that is not what Popper can mean by it, right? Popper cannot mean that we tentatively accept the truth of the theory, because if we tentatively accept the truth of the theory based on some evidence, then we've been engaging in induction. What Popper means, given the methodological story that he has told us, right, the only attitude that I take up as a scientist to a theory that has not yet been refuted is the attitude of using it as a hypothesis in my attempts at falsification. And that use does not imply any degree of belief. It does not imply any degree of confidence. So for Popper, acceptance must mean acceptance as a hypothesis in my next scientific experiment. But it's really hard to read the passage that way. It's really easy to read it with our normal meaning of acceptance in the back of our mind, to read this in a middle-of-the-road inductivist way, and not to read it in the extreme way that Popper the falsificationist must mean it. And if we misread it that way, then suddenly all kinds of problems that Popper has seem to disappear. Right? Here is one problem that Popper has. It's a problem that philosophers like Selman and Putnam have brought against Popper. What about the use of science in practice? Right? If I'm an engineer and I want to build a bridge, I'm not going to be engaged in this practice of falsification, right? I mean, that's not the point of what I'm doing. I'm not coming up with a wild hypothesis and trying to falsify it. I want to build a bridge that I'm pretty confident is going to stand, is going to not collapse as soon as, people move over it. So I need a theory that I can accept, that I have confidence in. Now that acceptance might be tentative, right? It could be falsified, but it's not going to be very tentative, right? I mean, if I build a bridge and if I actually put human beings on there, I had better be almost certain of the validity of my underlying engineering theory, my underlying theory of mechanics. I can be wrong. I accept that I can be wrong, but I had better be almost certain, right? Very, very confident. Otherwise, it would be criminal of me to let people go on that bridge after it has been built. There's nothing in Popper's philosophy that allows me to do this, right? There's nothing in... Popper expressly forbids such confidence. Right? Because such confidence, you can only get it through inductive reasoning. It's always going to be about believing, accepting a theory, tentatively, of course. Everything is tentative in science. Believing or accepting a theory based on positive evidence, based on inductive reasoning, based on questions of how much does this evidence support that theory. That's the kind of stuff that Popper doesn't think ever happens. That Popper thinks is logically impossible. That Popper thinks is absolutely irrational. And so there are some really big problems that Popper has about our positive attitudes towards theories. And here Popper is again engaging in an ambiguity of language, this time using the word acceptance, in order to paper over these difficulties and in order to appear as the voice of, reason. Whereas what Popper ought to say, given his rejection of induction, is that there is no reason to believe that the bridge will not collapse. Wow, okay, that's pretty extreme. And we have to think about how to deal with that. And I'm okay with a philosopher trying to deal with that, right? I'm not saying that Popper ought to have embraced induction. I love it when somebody does something like, reject induction and then tells a story about it. Hume does that. Fantastic. I don't think it works, but it's very interesting. What I do object against is somebody rejecting induction and then starting to write passages as if he had not rejected induction, while, of course, at the same time, 1 or 2 pages further on, again affirming that he has really rejected induction and solved the problem of induction, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is basically, I would say, what is going on in these sections. This is, I think we already kind of see in these 2 pages of section 7 the basic shape of the entire rest of the article. So there are a couple of other curious moments in section 7. The most curious being the one about the Indian tribe and the tigers, where Popper kind of seems to suggest that truth is the same thing as usefulness for survivability, even though at another point he says, I don't mean usefulness, I mean truth. I don't know. I don't know what to make of that. But it's just a throwaway command between brackets, so let's not put too much emphasis on that. Let's go to section 8. So section 8 contains a numbered list of, Popper again affirming that there's something wrong with induction. And just before the number list, this is what he writes. He says, it is obvious that this rule or craft of valid induction is not even metaphysical. It simply does not exist. No rule can ever guarantee that a generalization inferred from true observations, however often repeated, is true. This is an absolute non sequitur, right? Yes, indeed, no rule can ever, I guess some rule, but not a real rule, not a rule that is actually true, that actually holds. No rule that actually holds can ever guarantee that a generalization inferred from true observations, however often repeated, is true. We might always be wrong. Everyone agrees with that, right? The inductivists agree with that. No inductivist has tried to give us a rule that is supposed to give us, with absolute perfection and certainty, the truth that can never then be shown to be false. No one. So why does Popper say, there is no such thing as valid induction, because, and then he says something that no defender of induction actually has tried to defend? Okay, I don't know. Continually, Popper is confusing the inductivist with the radical dogmatist, and it really feels like setting up a straw man to combat, right? And then saying, my falsificationism is right because this straw man is so strawy. He's so strawy, man. Wow, so much straw in that straw man. Yes, but you put the straw in there, right? That's not the inductivist at all. Okay, so induction is a myth. Is what we learn in this numbered list. And then at the end, he says, none of this is altered in the least if we say that induction makes theories only probable rather than certain. That seems to me to be completely false. One would have to, in this text, Popper doesn't say anything more about that, although he points at another text he has written here. It is like the crux of almost everything that we've said. Popper continually uses this criterion of certainty, of not being able to accommodate negative evidence, and so on and so forth, as the one thing he does, the failure of induction, even though it is no part of induction or of the inductivist position. And so this sort of throwaway remark that, you can just leave out all that stuff about certainty and not being open to negative evidence and still have the same argument. I don't know, that doesn't seem very strong to me. In section 9, Popper is going to once again phrase his analysis of how the problem of induction came about. He says it is the result of believing three things. Hume's discovery that it is impossible to justify a law by observation or experiment, since it transcends experience. B. The fact that science proposes and uses laws everywhere and all the time. And C. The principle of empiricism, which asserts that in science only observation and experiment may decide upon the acceptance or rejection of scientific statements, including laws and theories. So, A, Hume's discovery that it is impossible to justify a law by observation of experiment since it transcends experience, again suffers from the proof justification ambiguity, right? We all, I would say, agree that A is true if justify means prove. If instead of justify we read prove. Now Hume absolutely also thinks it's true if we read justify, right? He thinks that induction is absolutely irrational. But we should note that again is a pretty extreme position. And once again, by the way, I don't mean to say extreme means false. I mean, extreme is, well, okay, it's far outside of our normal ways of thinking. Give us arguments, right? We haven't been given very many arguments. So how can we see that it's extreme? Well, using one thing to justify something that transcends, using an experience to justify a claim that transcends experience is something we do every single time we make a prediction. Right? Every single time I make a prediction, I am transcending what I have experienced. And so to claim that it is impossible to justify by observation or experiment that which transcends experience is to say that it is impossible to justify by experience any prediction whatsoever. So we're not just talking about laws, we're talking about any prediction whatsoever. And so Hume is saying, right, that we cannot justify the claim that if I let go of this pen, it will fall. And yet I was very confident in its falling. And so Hume is going to say, well, that is just habit, right? There's no rationality there. And Popper says that too. Okay, maybe it's true. But again, you would need a lot of arguments to establish that because, it seems pretty problematic. At least it seems very far away from anything that we normally accept. And if we were to come to accept it based on Hume's and Popper's arguments, it's fair to think that that would destroy science as we know it. Right? It's not strange to think that it would destroy science as we know it. So if A is true, then maybe B should be given up. The fact that science proposes and uses laws everywhere and all the time. Well, science must be wrong, right? Okay, of course that is not Popper's own solution. Popper's own solution is to say that A, B, and C are all true. And okay, why? How can it be all true even though they seem to clash? We can see this the moment we realize that the acceptance by science of a law or of a theory is tentative only, which is to say that all laws and theories are conjectures or tentative hypotheses, and that we may reject a law or theory on the basis of new evidence without necessarily discarding the old evidence which originally led us to accept it. Again, the ambiguities are rife here. Tentative acceptance sounds like believing it until something negative comes up, but that's not what Popper means. What Popper means is using it as a hypothesis. Okay, there's no belief involved. There's no confidence involved. And so, it's not just that we may reject a law or theory on the basis of new evidence. Well, we may reject a law or theory on the basis of new evidence, but here rejection also has a special meaning. Like, rejection means we're no longer going to use it as a hypothesis in our experiments because we've already falsified it. We need something new to falsify. Rejection doesn't mean give up a belief because we never believed it in the first place. So again, Popper is using sort of this ingrained language of acceptance and rejection that we've been using in science, that inductivists have been using in science, but all these terms have a special Popperian meaning that it's really easy to sort of lose sight of. Like, the core of Popper's claim is, of course, the italicized sentence here. Only the falsity of the theory can be inferred from empirical evidence, and this inference is a purely deductive one. Right? The only thing we ever learn in science, according to Popper, is that a theory is false. Right? We never learn that it's true. We also never sort of learn that it's probable. Right? We never learn that it's likely to be true. We only ever learn that it's false. As soon as Popper gives that up, right? As soon as he says, oh, well, forget about that. I'm also, fine with likely to be true. Then he has become an inductivist, right? That would be the end of his falsificationism. So he can't go there. Well, he doesn't want to go there. In the final passage, we read what I think is maybe the worst of all these ambiguities. We do not prefer every non-falsified theory, only one which in the light of criticism appears to be better than its competitors, which solves our problems, which is well tested, and of which we think, or rather conjecture or hope, that it will stand up to further tests. So the theory that we prefer according to Popper, is one of which we think, or rather conjecture or hope, that it will stand up to further tests. The whole point of Popper's anti-inductivism is that we do not think, that is, believe. That is the meaning of think in a sentence like this. We do not believe that it will stand up to further tests. Rather, we conjecture it. But that conjecture is just, something that came into our minds that we do with the express purpose of just testing it, that we don't believe, that we have no confidence in, no probability, etc., etc., etc. I keep repeating this, but I have to keep repeating it because Popper keeps muddying the water. What does he mean? We think, or rather conjecture. It's not rather conjecture, it is the absolute opposite of thinking. Like, the thinking here, the believing here, is the exact thing that he is opposed to, that his entire philosophy tries to get rid of, tries to do without. But he writes it out in such a way that it seems that to conjecture something is just a way of thinking it, right? That's just a precisification of the idea of thinking. No, it comes in the place of thinking. It is precisely what makes it Popperian rather than inductivist. We don't think, believe, or I would say even hope that it will stand up to further tests. We just conjecture that. That's the only thing we can do. Of course, this generates the practical problem that I talked about, right? The problem of the engineer. How am I going to build a bridge based on a theory that I can only conjecture but not think will stand up to further tests? Right? The building of the bridge is a further test. I had better think that it will stand up to further tests. Well, Popper says that it is perfectly reasonable to act on the assumption that the future will, in many respects be like the past, and that well-tested laws will continue to hold, since we can have no better assumption to act upon. Right? So Popper is saying here, and this is basically his solution to the practical problem that I've been setting out, but it's also astonishing. Popper says it's reasonable to act on the assumption that well-tested laws will continue to hold. And that sounds very strange, because he has told us that it's not reasonable to believe that well-tested laws will continue to hold. So why would it be reasonable to act on the assumption that they will continue to hold? Like, usually we think it's reasonable to act on an assumption if it is reasonable to believe the assumption. Well, Popper has a slightly different interpretation or reason for that. It's between the brackets. It's since we can have no better assumption to act upon. Right? If you have a couple of courses of action and one of them is better than the others, well, no matter how bad it is, you'd better choose the better one. Right? Even if it's the best of a lot of bad things, you should still choose the best thing. But why on earth is it the best? Right? It's not reasonable to believe in the truth of this assumption, and it's not reasonable to believe in the truth of any other assumption. So, although it might be true in some trivial sense that we have no better assumption than whatever law it is that we've been testing, it is also in Popper's system true that we have no worse assumption than the ones that we've been testing. At the very least, no worse assumption among all the non-falsified theories. Okay, the falsified theories are surely false, so maybe we shouldn't use those. But all the non-falsified ones seem to be on the exact same level. We're not supposed to believe any of them. We're not supposed to have any confidence in them. Nothing Popper has told us explains why acting on one of them would be more rational than acting on another. And nothing Popper tells us here, or I would suggest anywhere else, explains how you can make such a distinction between hypotheses without engaging in induction, right? Without saying, well, all the evidence we have is actually more positive for theory A than for theory B, right? You have to see evidence in terms of positivity, in terms of generating confidence, if you want, one of the theories to get out better than the others. Otherwise, all of them will always remain at the zero level of irrational to have any confidence in them. So Popper here doesn't really go into his own word corroboration very much, but there's a big philosophical literature about Popper's attempt to set up corroboration as an alternative to confirmation, and frankly not being able to explain how once you drop induction there can be anything like rational preference for one unfalsified theory over another unfalsified theory. In these kinds of practical situations where what we want is belief that the theory will be true, or at least that the next test of the theory, the building of the bridge, is going to be a positive test, is going to fit the theory rather than falsify it. Right? There might be good theories to prefer, good reasons to prefer one theory or another in purely speculative science, right? Because we want to have certain kinds of tests and we want something to falsify or whatever. But when it comes to these kinds of practical situations, surely we want the theory that is most likely to give us the right prediction. And nothing, Popper's philosophy has been set up expressly in such a way that there is nothing that can give us confidence that a theory will generate the right prediction. That there is, because that transcends experience, right? And there is no induction, at least no rational induction. Okay, so that I think takes us to the end of the article. Well, there is a long appendix in which Popper mentions some problems and mostly just mentions them, right? And says, well, my ideas here have enabled me to think through all these other problems, but he doesn't really say enough about them for us to have a serious discussion about those. I said already a little bit about number 13 when in one of the early videos when we talked about induction and how you can criticize induction, right? Because there Popper says, look, okay, some people say that induction can't be justified by deduction, but so what, right? I mean, why should we expect it to be justified by deduction? And he says, oh, this is terrible. And I don't know. I mean, we talked about that earlier, and what shines through there really is Popper's fear that if you allow induction to go on without a deductive basis, then you open the floodgates to everything, right? Okay, I want to say a couple more things. One thing I want to say about induction is that, of course, I have been taking very, very clearly the position of the inductivist against Popper here. And that may make it seem as if I think that induction is unproblematic, trivial, that maybe we don't need to justify it, that we don't need a philosophical theory of induction or anything like that. And that's actually not my position, right? I think that induction is, at least at first sight, pretty mysterious. And that what you would want from a philosophical theory, from an epistemology, from a metaphysics, is you do want some kind of explanation of why induction works. And so I think that if no such explanation is forthcoming, then a position like Popper's, which says that induction just doesn't exist, I don't think it's inescapable, but I do think it starts looking more plausible, right? So solving the problem of induction, saying something intelligible about the problem of induction, at the very least, if you can't do that, and I think a lot of philosophers say, okay, you can't do that, whatever, let's forget about it. If you can't do that, I think that would be a good reason to take another look at Hume and at Popper and to take them more seriously. What I have taken issue with mostly is not so much Popper's, being critical about induction, but Popper being critical about inductivism in ways that I think are just unfair, and pushing his own philosophy in ways that I also think are unfair, namely by suggesting that it really fits scientific practice quite well. And I don't think it fits scientific practice quite well. And so I agree with Popper that the problem of induction is a real and serious problem, but I disagree with Popper in terms of what would be left if there's no solution, right? No solution in the sense of a justification of induction, or at least some kind of story about the world in which induction makes sense. And I think there are lots of metaphysical stories in contemporary philosophy in which induction doesn't make sense, right? Like neo-Humean metaphysics, like the stuff of David Lewis, for instance. I think that if that's what you accept, then induction is impossible, right? And then, I would say, well, either Popper is right, and I don't think he's right, or science is impossible, and both of them are terrible. It had better be the case that neo-Humean metaphysics doesn't work. Okay, I think it doesn't work. But that's okay. So I just want to say that in order to show that I'm not wholly unsympathetic to Popper's approach to the problem of induction. I just think that the way that he then moves on from that, and the ways that he defends his own position and attacks other people, are sometimes disingenuous and are not doing anyone any favors. I also think that they have actively and actually led to many, many misunderstandings of Popper's philosophy. So Popper himself complains early on in this article that nobody understood him. Well, none of his critics understood him. I think it's maybe even more fair to say that very few of his defenders understood him. Because all these ambiguities make it seem as if Popper says things and is allowed to say things that, if you really think them through, don't fit his anti-inductivist stance at all. And so what I could add to that is that I think one of the reasons to read this article, it's not just because it's historically interesting to read Popper and to know about his ideas. It's also to become sensitive to this kind of problem. Because, I'm not here to say that Popper sort of intentionally wrote this to create ambiguities. I do think maybe that Popper, on the one hand is convinced of his philosophical stance, and on the other hand is convinced that he is a friend of science, and that these ambiguities sort of enter his writing and even his thinking in order to bring these two parts, which are very hard, maybe impossible to bring together, in order to bring them together. And we should be sensitive to these kinds of ambiguities, these kinds of verbal slides, like in uses of accept and tentative and, think, all those things. We should be sensitive to them in other people's writings, but also in our own writings, right? Because that is going to allow us to see, if I fall into an ambiguity here, that might indicate a serious problem in my own thinking. And if we can incorporate a stance like that, like this way of like really critically engaging with our own thinking and our own writing, if we can incorporate that into our way of doing philosophy, then I think we have really taken what was useful and good about Popper's critical rationalism, which is perhaps not so much, the exact theory that he comes up with, but it's an ideal of self-criticism and of avoiding dogmatism that surely, for each of us, remains relevant always. So, thank you for that. Who knows, maybe we'll do more Popper in the future, but this is the end of the article, Science, Conjectures and Refutations.